Hello, everybody. This is Jade with the third episode of the Octopus Literary Podcast. You may notice that I am in a different place today. This change of venue is just going to be something that happens sometimes. So I'd like to start out with the episode with apologizing for last week. Last week's episode was super long, and I didn't have a lot of things that I was super happy about saying in the episode. So I've decided that from now on I'm going to try to cut down the episode times unless I really have some super interesting stuff to say. So the name of the game from this point forward is to get through my points and only my best points as quickly as possible. So if you saw last week's episode and were bored to tears, please try this episode out. If you don't like it after this week, I don't know what to tell you. So yeah, this week we're covering chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Old Man's War by John Scalzi. In these three chapters, John basically learns war. For the last couple episodes worth of chapters, he's been preparing physically as far as getting his new body and actually getting to space. But this week he is preparing mentally. He's doing military training. He's a leader in his platoon, so he's starting to think the way he's going to need to think as a soldier and probably as a leader in the larger CDF. And he has his first real battle in chapter 9. So yeah. At the beginning of chapter 7, the platoon on Beta Pixis 3, which includes John and Alan, begins their training. So their master sergeant is a man named Antonio Ruiz, and he spends a whole lot of time just telling them that he does not believe in them. He doesn't believe in almost any of his recruits, and these people are no exception. And the recruits don't generally take him seriously because this is what they've seen in the movies for the last 75-ish years. So Sergeant Ruiz tells them, "You're under the impression that after a few weeks of training, my gruff but fair facade will begin to slip, and I will show some inkling of being impressed with the lot of you, and that at the end of your training, you'll have earned my grudging respect. You're under the impression that I'll think fondly of you while you're off making the universe safe for humanity, secure in the knowledge I've made you better fighting men and women. Your impression, ladies and gentlemen, is completely and irrevocably fucked." So he goes on to talk about how horrible the war is, which is, par for the course. And then he tells them that their ideas all come from seeing movies, and that they're quote, "not in a military comedy anymore, are they?" And this is effective at letting us know that this book, and well, particularly the next few chapters, are going to be extremely violent. But I think this is one of the first narrative choices that I kind of questioned in this book series. It's a pretty small beat, but he says, "You're not in a military comedy anymore, are you?" This book is a military comedy. And he says that after a few weeks of training, his gruff but fair facade will begin to slip. Or he says that that's not going to happen, but that is what happens. A lot of people think that the jokes, "we're not in a movie," shows that a writer doesn't know anything else to say. They're just grasping for stuff. And even though I felt like it worked here, I think a lot of the audience is just going to see this joke here and say, "Ah, it's that cheap joke that I've seen a million times." So, yeah, not the best beat, but overall, Master Sergeant Ruiz is an absolutely delightful character who is just full of delightfully mean things to say, and I just enjoyed this whole 2 chapters with him in it. So he goes through and just for several pages just tells all the recruits why he hates them individually. He starts with the people who were already in the military. So he tells he calls forward all of the people who have been in the military before, and he tells them that these people are typically the most useless because they already have habits that are not applicable to these battles. And in the middle of this rant, he says, we saw that whole subcontinental war of yours, the one where they nuked India. 6 fucking years to beat an enemy that barely had firearms and you had to cheat to win. Nukes are for pussies. So I pulled this out because later on in this same set of chapters, we find out that some of the other alien species that they're fighting are really see this as a game. And there's some level of matching your opponent's capabilities in combat that some of the species are using. And if the humans broke this game by using nukes, probably a lot of the other species would just go after humanity, and we wouldn't just be one of the 100 other species they're fighting anymore. We would be public enemy number 1 for a lot of species. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So every time Sergeant Ruiz, so Sergeant Ruiz has a lot of like groups of people that he doesn't like. So he calls everybody forward who's part of that group, and he tells them that they have to go run 5 clicks, I think, in under an hour. And so first he tells this to the people who have already been in the military. He goes through a bunch of other groups, Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, government workers, doctors, lawyers, and teachers. But interestingly, so the second group of people he pulls out are homosexuals. And he tells everybody, he tells the 4 people who step forward who say they're gay, that he doesn't like them because they typically confess to their squad mates right before they're about to die, which is a distraction. And this is presented as a pretty effective joke, and kind of he comes across as generally positive towards gay people, just not in this one specific situation. My complaint about this, and this is the only other complaint I have in this set of chapters, so don't worry, is that this feels like a relic from a previous draft of this book, because this only makes sense if everybody in the platoon is male. But this whole platoon is co-ed. Every squad has a blend of genders. So anybody is liable to be confessing to anybody at any time. Not anybody, but there's men and women on each, and you're not restricted to homosexuals doing any confessing. So yeah, I just felt like this joke came from a previous edition of the script, and then when he put in women or something, or remembered that there were women, he just didn't take it out. Yeah, that's my last complaint for today. So then I'm sorry, we have something that's almost a complaint next. But this was actually quite good. So eventually, after all these groups of people are sent off, the last person standing is John. And I thought this was kind of delightful commentary on the stereotypical everyman protagonist who fits into, who isn't in any super weird groups because you have to be able to identify with him. This guy identifies with nobody because stereotypically he would be a blank slate. He's not, but in this case, he kind of is. So Ruiz confronts him, and he accuses him of trying to avoid running the 5 clicks. And And so Ruiz starts asking him a bunch of questions to find something that he's offended by. And eventually, he asks what John did for a living. And John says he was self-employed as a writer. And at this point, I actually stopped and rolled my eyes. I was a little weirded out by the homosexual stuff in the last page, but this, I rolled my eyes because this is still an issue in American books, don't get me wrong, but in Japanese light novels specifically, a lot of times the protagonist just is a light novel writer, and they're just extremely obviously a self-insert for the author, to the point where a lot of light novels are just unreadable, or rather the majority of them are, because your protagonists are this level of bland or overpowered or Gary Stu. So when I saw that this protagonist was a writer, also the protagonist's name is John, which is also the first name of the author, I went, oh no, we have a self-insert here from John Scalzi. But I shouldn't have doubted, because we next get this line, "Tell me you wrote fiction, recruit," Ruiz said. "I have a bone to pick with novelists." "No, Master Sergeant." "Christ, man, what did you write?" "I wrote advertising copy, Master Sergeant." So he threw me for a loop a little bit, but I actually really like this because, one, I was tricked. My expectations were subverted. I thought that something was going to happen that didn't. And two, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I've ever read a book where the protagonist wrote advertisements. It's a pretty obscure, I guess, in the world of sci-fi protagonists, occupation. So I thought it was pretty cool that that's what John did. I was a little annoyed, though, that in last week's episode, we saw John's aptitude test, and he said that he did really poorly with words. That doesn't really make sense if he is a writer, but, okay. Anyway, so then comes probably my favorite part in this whole section, where John tells Master Sergeant Ruiz that he wrote a specific, but he came up with a concept for a mascot for a tire company. The mascot's name is Willy Wheelie. It's got to be like the Michelin Man, but, you know, serial numbers filed off. And Sergeant Ruiz tells him that when he was going through a pretty difficult divorce, he saw Willy Wheelie and Willy Wheelie's slogan, which is, "Sometimes you just gotta hit the road." And it was what inspired him to leave his wife, who wanted to divorce him, and just keep moving on in life. And he actually has a tattoo of Willy Wheelie on his shoulder. And for this reason, he decides to make John the leader of the platoon. And I thought this was super cool because, you know, this whole podcast, or this whole book, we've been talking about how John is different from a similar situation protagonist of maybe another sci-fi book who would be incredibly gifted at combat or military strategy. John's primary character trait is that he is compassionate and that he connects to people. And his first promotion is because he connected to somebody he didn't even know. And yes, it was accidental, but it's incredibly thematic. I thought this was a masterful bit of writing here. Not the words itself, but this scene and this turn of events I've really enjoyed. So because he is now the leader of the platoon, he gets sent off to run with everybody else. And he picks out 5 people to be the squad leaders. So he's the leader of Squad A. He has Alan be his second in command. Alan is the friend who came with him from the Old Farts. And so he picks 5 people, one of whom is a CEO, one of whom is a former rancher, one of whom is a former kindergarten teacher, one of whom is a former colonel in the Marines. So he actually picks these people, I think, pretty well. So John picks out 5 people who are going to be the new leaders of the squads in the platoon. And I was actually pretty impressed with this because he only had like an hour to listen to people's records and decide who would be the leaders. So it shows that John actually has quite a bit of leadership aptitude. So this was a good job for him. He says to the new squad leaders, "I'm not planning to be a hard ass on you. Sergeant Ruiz has that job covered, and I'd just be a pale imitation. It's not my style." So, yet another restatement of the fact that John isn't a hardened soldier who screams at everybody and is bloodthirsty or whatever. He just asks for help. He tells people what they need to do, and he offers help if they need it. So then we move on to chapter 8, where John actually starts to be a leader. So he's been assigned leader, but now he's acting as a leader in this chapter. At first, what happens is Sergeant Ruiz has them go through a bunch of exercises that are supposed to get them used to being extraordinarily capable superhumans. Such as, 7 second 100-meter sprints, 6-foot vertical jumps, leaping across 10-meter holes in the ground, that kind of stuff. And then eventually they get to a challenge where they have to hold some sandbags and sink down to the bottom of a pool, and they have to sit down and they have to sink down there for 7 minutes. And John begins to freak out almost immediately because when he was a kid, he got stuck under a tarp in a pool and almost drowned. So he has a phobia of water. Now, what's interesting about this, absolutely fascinating, is that last week we saw John tell us that he enjoys swimming. Now, this at first sounds like it's contradictory, but based on what we learn about John in general and in the actual battle later on, this is incredibly inspiring. So basically, John was afraid of water, and so he developed a love of swimming because he wanted to take control of the thing that he was afraid of. If he is an extraordinarily strong swimmer, he cannot drown. And this extends later when they are fighting the other platoons. They do a big war game with all of the training platoons, and John doesn't want his platoon to lose, obviously. So he orders everybody to collect as much information as possible and populate a map with it on their brain pals, so that everybody in the platoon is always as informed as possible and cannot be surprised. This is an extremely logical extension of the swimming pool thing. He has something that could be a danger to him, and so he takes control of the situation so that it cannot actually hurt him. This is great character development. John begins to freak out. Back to the present with the swimming pool. John begins to freak out, and Alan actually calms him down and gets him to focus on the rest of the squads. And so I thought this was really cool, because the first thing we found out about Alan is that he didn't look back at Earth as they were leaving, right? he is not a very emotional person. Um, but he was the one who checked on John after Leon died. He's actually a damn good friend, right? He doesn't feel things as acutely as the rest of the old farts or anybody else does, but he does a really good job understanding other people's feelings and acting on it. Later on in these chapters, Alan is promoted to a squad leader, and he does a very good job, and I understand why. So then the troops are given their CDF standard issue MP35 infantry rifle. I read that whole thing out because we're going to be seeing a lot of it, I'm sure, for the rest of this book, if not the rest of the series. John doesn't talk about Kathy at all in these 3 chapters, actually. He doesn't talk about any of the old farts other than Alan, and he doesn't talk about Kathy. But the place in his heart where Kathy used to be is replaced by the MP35 infantry rifle. Okay, I'm kidding, but seriously, he loves this thing, and for good reason. It says, depending on your need, it can create and fire on the fly 6 different types of projectiles or beams. This thing is cool as shit. I want one. It can send out microwave energy beams, high pressure flammable fluid, low yield grenades, guided rockets. This is what Elon Musk should build after the flamethrower. Anyway, Ruiz tells them that in 30 years of service, there has yet to be an MP35 that has malfunctioned. Now, at first I thought, oh, that means it's gonna malfunction, right? It's like if you hear in a book that there's a prison that has never been escaped from, you go, oh, okay, somebody's gonna break out of this prison. But in this case, by telling us there has yet to be an MP35 that has malfunctioned, I think what Scalzi is trying to do is say, look, don't be concerned about this malfunctioning. That's not going to be a plot element here. Think about the rest of the fight when you're paying attention to what's going on. Also, it's telling us that it's built with alien technology, like everything else. So John spends several pages getting acquainted with his new one true love, the MP, which he spells out from here on out as EMPEE, like a Star Wars droid, like they do in Star Wars with the droids, which are sentient, because he loves this gun. So they link up their brain pals with their MPs, and Ruiz gives yet another speech about how horrifying this war is and how hard everything is going to be. And at the end of it, he says, "Do you understand now? Do you finally have an idea of what you're up against? Do you?" And that's the end of the section. I pulled this out because this is another one of those sentences that I've been mentioning, where it's Scalzi actually addressing the reader. Before, in the very second chapter, Harry said something like, "This is gonna get a whole lot weirder, so hang on to your seats." This is like part of the payoff for that. We're in the weird part. So then John describes some of the classes that they've been taking, which include, well, actually, it's just the one class that he describes, but they talk about 2 of the species that humanity has encountered since becoming an interstellar species. The first one we talk about, and I'm calling these out just in case we see them again. They might not be mentioned again, but you know, I want to remember it in case we do. So the first one is the Bathunga. They are, as far as I can tell, they're like giant, like oysters that are black. But that is not at all how they're described. I actually had a bit of trouble picturing how exactly this is supposed to look, but I think that was purposeful. It says, a nightmare popped up, something black and gnarled with serrated lobster claws that nestled pornographically inside an orifice so dank you could very nearly smell the stench. You're not supposed to be able to picture these things, but that kind of goes with the territory for this book. We don't actually have the physical descriptions for anyone. We don't get the physical descriptions for the alien that John fights later either. So I'm kind of used to John's inner monologue, some dialogue, and that's it as the meat and potatoes of this book. There's also another. So the Bethunga are a pacifist race. They live in the bottom of the ocean, I think. Yep, they live in the ocean, and they peacefully coexist with humans, and they're super technologically advanced. And then the other people are the Salang. They look like satyrs, as far as I can tell. And they actually enslaved a colony of humans and made a meat farm out of them. I'm not sure if we'll see them again, but that gives us kind of the spectrum of aliens we're dealing with. Some of them are going to be super nice pacifists that we coexist with peacefully, and then some of them are going to all the adult human males but a handful were killed, and those that were kept were milked for their sperm. Yeah, that's the other end of the spectrum. It says you can't afford anthropomorphic biases when some of the aliens most like us would rather make human hamburgers than peace. So just another nail in that John Scalzi is hammering into our heads that, yeah, I understand that you're used to Star Trek and, being nice to the aliens and finding compromise, but this is not that kind of book. We're just going to kill them. So next we get this passage. So a recruit asks Oglethorpe, is the name of the teacher, why should we feel any attachment to the colonists? They're only human after all. Why not breed CDF soldiers as the next step in human evolution and give ourselves a leg up? I was surprised that somebody said that. Now on my second, more slow read, I saw it as more, like pro-human, like, hey, why don't we give everybody this gene so that these genes so that humanity has a better chance of survival. But on my first read, and I still think this is something that a lot of people are going to see if they just read this once through, I thought that she was saying, yes, those tiny, puny humans, they're not as good as me, person who's been green for 1 month. And I was surprised that this came from the mouth of an adult, a person who has lived an entire lifetime. I wouldn't expect this sentiment to come from anyone over the age of 14, but here we are. So yeah, I was pretty surprised that somebody said that. But Oglethorpe gives an interesting philosophical discussion that I'm not going to get too far into, but I am going to read a little bit of. Well, first he says that they can't use any of the genes that they put into the recruits for reproduction. All of these bodies that they've created are sterile. Now, the recruits are still being given bodies afterwards that are normal, but they won't have any alien DNA. But the Oglethorpe tells her that part of the reason they chose old people to fight is because old people have raised communities, have raised children and grandchildren, and you understand the value of doing something beyond your own selfish goals. Even if you never become colonists yourselves, you still recognize that human colonies are good for the human race and worth fighting for. It's hard to drill that concept into the brain of a 19-year-old, but you know from experience. In this universe, experience counts. This is just a really neat encapsulation of the whole theme of this book. And I really liked this scene also. So we find out that Sarah, the kindergarten teacher who became a squad leader, was not able to actually effectively lead a squad. And that joke that a kindergarten teacher would probably be good at leading the squad was funny. But this is basically saying, yeah, that's funny, but this isn't a satire. This book is funny, but it still has serious stuff to say. In real life, a kindergarten teacher probably wouldn't be able to just lead a platoon. So this is when Alan becomes the leader of that squad. So finally, John and everybody else does this war game that I was talking about earlier, where they have to fight everybody else, and John has everybody open up a channel with everybody else so that they can make a huge map that notes the location of all the enemies and all the safe spots. And it definitely shows us how much potential John has as a leader, particularly a leader that people are eager to get behind. We see that personally in Alan, who always supports John and is always backing him up. But I feel pretty strongly that everybody else under John's command feels similarly to how Alan does. There's one guy that they have to discipline pretty harshly, but they don't seem to have any other issues. And that's the power of a compassionate protagonist, right? They don't go around making enemies. They go around making results. So at the end of chapter 8, Alan and John are getting on the ship that will take them to their new ship, which is called the Modesto. And Ruiz tells John that he actually respects him a little bit. It says, Master Sergeant Antonio Ruiz has declared that you are not nearly the dipshit that most of your fellow recruits have turned out to be. So that thing that Ruiz said that he wasn't going to say, he said it. But then he says, don't let it go to your head, Private. You are still a dipshit, just not a very big one. I thought it was charming. Then, in chapter 9, John has his first real military battle against real aliens. And these guys are called the Kansu. And just to illustrate my point from a couple minutes ago, we have no idea what the Kansu look like. I imagine they are big, hulking brutes. But I had to come up with that myself. We know that their brains are in their thorax, because that's where John shoots them. They have 3, layers of their war declaration cry. You have to get through all of their 3 layers. The first one is somebody comes out and a low-ranking person member of their military comes out, gives the message that they're going to begin fighting. The second is a person of medium rank coming out to ceremonially kill another soldier. And then the third is someone who comes and sings their death. So the Kansu, we actually find out quite a bit about them, but they will come and if they decide they want a planet, they will come and just start picking people off until you answer them with enough force that they consider it respectful. So otherwise they'll just keep killing people. So then you do battle with them. If you lose, well, they kill you, clearly. But if you win, they never come back. And it says, it was like the battle was the vaccination and we were the antiviral. The point about all this, other than reiterating this information in case we see it again, is because we are going to see it again. This is a lot of information about a group of aliens, when we only found out a little bit about the previous 2. I already forgot what they're called. The fawn guys and the oyster guys. What are they called? No idea. The Kansu? I remember them because we described them for 6 pages. Um, there's also a dude here in this battle named Watson, and Watson is like Leon Deke light. He thinks that war is funny. There was another recruit in the previous chapter who also thought that the guns were really funny and got shat on all over by Ruiz. Watson is bragging about how he could kill any of these guys. How did he live this long? So the Kansu starts singing, and he gives them a song about what this battle means to the Kansu, effectively. And the last couple lines is, it is not your fortune to have been born among the people. So it's unfortunate for you, the humans, that you were not born Kansu. So we set you upon the path that leads to redemption. In other words, we're going to kill you so you can become Kansu, presumably in reincarnation. Be brave and fight with fierceness that you may come into our fold at your rebirth. So they consider themselves to effectively be Valhalla. If you fight with fierceness, you can become a Kansu when you come back to life. This blessed battle hallows the ground, and all who die and are born here henceforth are delivered. So the Kansu believe that their goal is to kill the opposing forces and take over this planet, right? They would like to put a colony here, populate it, and they want, and they believe that the enemy soldiers who die here protecting this land will be reborn here as members of the Kansu. So I had to read that several times to get it, but so I wanted to put that translation here. But the CDF says that the CDF thinks that this is basically their national anthem and they consider this to be a game. But John really, really doubts this. So the battle begins, and John figures out that you can actually program your rifle to shoot 2 bullets, first to take down their shield, and second to kill them in their brains, which are in their thorax. So they're actually surprised that there is a shield, for one, because none of the other species that they have gotten information from have said that there is shielding. And what's interesting about that is that, so the Kansu is a species that adjusts their level of technological advancement to whoever they're fighting. So they will use sticks if their opponents are using sticks. The fact that none of the other aliens got their opponents having shields tells me that the humans are actually more badass than most of the other species that the Kansu have fought, if not all of them. So that tells us a little bit about the level of technological advancement that humanity is at. So John actually programs Asshole to fire two bullets, one after another, and disseminates this program to everyone in the platoon. And this is devastatingly effective. This is actually the key to them winning the fight. So John is able to think on his feet actually much better than I expected him to be able to at the start of this book. I'm keeping an eye on this because I want to see if this ends up tying back to the whole swimming thing, where maybe he was afraid of the Kansu and then tried to take control of the situation by creating this program, but I think that's a little bit of a stretch. So what happens next is one of the Kansu kills Watson. Watson is the guy who was bragging about how he's such a badass and he can kill all these Kansu, blah, blah, blah. So the interesting thing here is that we've seen a few war-hungry idiots in this book so far, and the book just keeps punishing them. So the first was Leon, and he died before he even got the chance to get a new body. The next was the guy in the last chapter that I barely talked about, who was bragging about his gun, and he got yelled at by Ruiz. And then this guy, Watson, gets killed in his very first battle. So the message of this book has something to do with, don't get bogged down in how horrible stuff is. Like, this is still a fun book. But don't get too over the top, silly, and cocky, right? Or the message of this thread in the book. So even though John hates Watson and was really nervous that Watson was going to get him killed, he goes back after the battle and gets him, and carries him back. So that tells us that, you know, John has become a leader. John has become a person who is capable of thinking on their feet and disseminating new tactics extremely quickly, but he's still the same guy. He's still the guy who is going to go back and get the asshole that died on the field. And from this point on, he doesn't, just like how he never said anything bad about Leon, he doesn't say anything bad about Watson either. He just picks him up and carries him to the morgue. There are creatures eating him when he comes and gets him. Well, there are creatures eating Watson when John comes to get Watson's body, which is exactly what Ruiz told them was going to happen told them happened in his very first battle. So it's just par for the course. He brings Watson's body back, and he talks to Alan while just carrying this dude's corpse. He talks to Alan about how he thinks the CDF is underestimating the Kansu. And this is where John's whole character ties together. He's a compassionate person, as we've seen throughout this whole book, but John, as the protagonist, has a military advantage because he is able to extend that compassion and empathy to observing and analyzing an opponent and their intentions in a way that other people simply aren't capable of. So that's just a really good that's a really good character design for a science fiction protagonist. But also it wraps together John's whole set of qualities into something that is incredibly useful for this specific plot. It's good writing. Also, the Kansu that killed Watson was screaming "redeemed, redeemed, redeemed" as loud as he could after Watson died, which is what tips John off to this. He says that he thinks that the Kansu still believe that they possess this land because blood has been spilled on it. Their blood in this case, but they still possess it. So John says that he hopes that he and Alan are long dead by the time the Kansu return. They aren't going to be. I think the Kansu are coming back. And then finally, some of the higher-ups come up and approach John, and one of them offers to buy him a drink, and it is sort of, it's kind of shorthand for, you are receiving a commendation, you did a really good job, because they don't have to pay for anything, so it's not important that they, the fact that somebody's buying him a drink isn't what's important. What's important is the gesture. You did really good by creating this strategy that ended up winning us this battle. And so this is the start of John as an excellent military commander. And the last sentence of this section is, "That was how my first battle went. My era of war had begun." So yeah, that's chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Old Man's War. Next week we will cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. We are, according to my Kindle, we are exactly 50% of the way through this book. So we're right on schedule. This week's discussion question is, if the other aliens are playing a game, in this case, like the CDF believes the Kansu is, if the other aliens see this as something other than fighting for survival, is it worth it to disrupt that game, to go all out and attack them with nukes or whatever we have and disrupt the status quo? Would you do anything, I guess is my question, would you do anything to try to stop this cycle that's apparently controlling most of the aliens in the galaxy? Alright, that's the end of this week's episode. See you next week.